We're going to walk through the steps today of how to build some dump trucks, or you might call them haul trucks. This is a sample of one of them. Pretty simple thing made out of 2x4s, and you can put 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 inch wheels on it depending on what your preference is. And we'll just walk through some of the steps, give you some hints on how to make these go a little easier that are applicable to a lot of the toys you may be building. So we're going to start out with a set of plans, and there's a set of plans available on the website, and just print them out. They're full scale, and you might want to print out 2 copies depending on what your level of confidence is. We're going to cut those out and the individual parts and make some templates. And these templates, I make my templates out of 1/8 inch hardboard. And what I do is I glue that piece of paper that I printed out onto the hardboard and then cut out the template on a scroll saw. And it makes it real easy to make multiple items and just put it down and trace around it. So I've got 2 different templates on this particular toy that we're going to be building. Now, how you stick the paper onto the hardboard, there's a couple of different ways to do that. One is use Elmer's rubber cement. Typical thing that you might have around the office or the home. That'll work fine. There's also a product called Mod Podge, which you can get at the hobby stores, and that works well too. It's water-based and it cleans up well, and you won't have any problems with it. You can also use spray adhesives and other things because we're looking at a permanent thing. We're not looking to remove these pieces of paper from these templates. So once we have these glued down and cut out, then we move on to marking a 2x4, plain 2x4, and just lay it down on there. And on this one, I've used the edges of the 2x4 to be the bottom of the vehicle, and that'll work well. There's an alternative way of laying these out, and that's laying them out so the bottom of the vehicle meets in the center. Now, there's a real advantage to this because if I cut these out and then drill them, or if I even drill them as they are here, I'm drilling close to the edge. And if you're using pine, it's real easy to get the drill bits to break out. And you'll just rip your hole out, and you either have to do a lot of gluing to repair your hole, or you might just end up scrapping the thing out. Depends on the grain of the wood and some other factors. But if you lay them out this way, and then you mark your holes where you want them and you drill them, they're not going to tear out, and you're going to save yourself a lot of grief. And after you drill your holes, make sure that then you cut them out. But one of the things when you drill holes also is to use a brad point drill bit. It's going to cut cleaner. It's not going to tend to tear the wood up so much. And set it on your drill press or with your drill so that you're drilling until the point barely goes through the back here. Do that on however many you're drilling. Then turn them over and run that same drill bit into that place where you got the little hole where the point came through. And you're less likely to break out the back side of the wood when you do that. You should have a clean hole on both sides. The most you might have to do is take some small chips and clean them out. So we do that, and we end up with a piece of wood that looks like this. And this particular one's been drilled out for a 1/4 inch dowel rod axle. If you're using 1/4 inch dowel rods, I suggest using a 9/32 inch hole. It gives you plenty of clearance for oversized dowel rods, which you'll occasionally get. Also gives you clearance if you got a dowel rod that's been warped. The last one I picked up in the shop moved all over the place. It was not nice and round and straight anymore, but when you cut them up into pieces to fit in here, there's plenty of room for those to turn. So we've got this. That's a simple thing to do. Now we need to cut out the bed on the truck. This is where the cargo would go into. And I've laid those out on a piece of 2x4 that I've cut down to 2.5 inches wide. The 2.5 inches wide is an inch wider than what this truck body is right here. Gives you a 1/2 inch overlap on both sides, covers up the wheels nicely, looks good. There's nothing critical about that 2.5 inch dimension. It's just what looks good to me. So we laid these out. You can lay them out like this. Utilize your wood to your best. Run all of this stuff through a bandsaw. And the small bandsaw out in the shop is perfect for this type of thing if you want to go out the shop and make some of these. Your blade choice is not real critical. The finer the tooth blade, the cleaner your edges will be, maybe the little less sanding that you'll be doing. But cut those out on the bandsaw, and when you cut them out, this is what you come out with, a solid block like this. Next step you have to take is to mark a line 1/4 inch off of this surface right here. We're going to make that cut, and when we make that cut right there, we're going to end up with 2 pieces that we're going to make more cuts in. When you make this cut, make sure you mark the matching edges on this. I got little dots on here. If you don't mark those matching edges, when you go back to put them together, you're going to be fumbling around all over the place trying to get them to match up. And because your lines are going to be irregular, because you got sawtooth marks in there, if you don't match them up, it's going to be pretty ugly. So make sure you mark them up. After we mark that and we cut that, you now have 2 pieces. You have a thin piece like this, and you have a solid piece that you cut off. And now we're going to cut out the center of this thing for the dump bed, and we're going to take this surface, again, mark off 1/4 inch right there, and it's nothing critical. You can eyeball that and get it as close as you need on something like this. You got to make sure that you mark the right surface on this, so that when you put it down on the bandsaw and you're running it through the bandsaw, you're cutting parallel and perpendicular to this surface down here. So now after we make that cut, you end up with your flat piece in the bottom, and you end up with this U-shaped piece, which is the front and the sides of the bed on this thing. We're going to be gluing these back together, so you need to make sure you've got your marks on there to match them all up. And then one thing you want to do before you glue them back together is you want to sand this area right here. You don't want to sand this area right here. That's where your saw cut was at. That's what matches up to the bottom of this piece right here, and you don't want to screw around with that to get a good tight fit. So take a piece of sandpaper, run it down in through here. Make sure you take all the rough stuff off of there. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. Just remember though, there's going to be small kids playing with these, and their fingers and hands are a little more tender than what ours are. So sand that off, and then we're going to be ready to glue things. And we're going to put those together like that's how they're going to fit. And then to glue them, I use a glue applicator that's called an accordion style glue applicator. Looks like this. It's available from Peachtree and a number of places. Most of them will work just fine. You want to make sure when you buy them that the tip is large enough that you can stick a paper clip down in them, because if you leave the cap off, they will set up down through this tip right here. It's kind of like a syringe or a hypodermic needle. It's not sharp on the end. It's blunt. But you can just pop this out of there and clean that out with a paper clip and when it dries up. And the nice thing about the accordion type glue applicator is you squeeze it to get glue out, and then when you want to stop, it expands back out and the glue flow stops immediately. If you're using a syringe type applicator, when you stop, there's still pressure in that syringe, and it's going to continue to push some glue out, and you'll have a mess to clean up and maybe get glue where you don't want it to be. So we're going to put glue on this surface here, that surface there, that surface there, and then we're going to stick them together. And you got a weird shape right there, and a little hard to clamp, But what I found is if you're using the right glue, you don't need to clamp that. If you just make sure it's positioned right, you squeeze it with your hands, you keep working it around for 30 seconds or something like that, you'll get some glue squeeze out, but you'll get this thing tight enough that you can then set it down on the table and let it set up. Now the glue that I've been using on these is a new Titebond product. I don't want this to sound like a commercial, but it says quick and thick on it, and it is thicker than the traditional Titebond products that you're used to working with, and it does seem to set up a lot faster. So in the fact that we've got a lot of sawtooth marks down these edges, we got some gaps in there, the thick fills those gaps up, and the quick setup allows you plenty of time to get it positioned, but then allows this thing to set up pretty quick, so if you need to handle it again, in a few minutes, you can feel safe doing that. So now that we've got a bed and we've got a body, we're going to want to glue them together, but I would suggest first that you put wheels on there. And if you're using 1 1/4 inch wheels, you can use the round ones like this. You can use the treaded ones that look like this, and whatever floats your boat. If you're using the treaded ones, you need to be using axle pegs, and you need to be drilling a 7/32 inch hole into the body instead of a 9/32. If you're using dowel rods, cut them to length, take them over to a sander, or just take a piece of sandpaper. Make sure you clean up the ends on these things. If you don't, you're going to have burrs, you're going to have sharp edges, and with a real close fit between your wheel and your axle, you're going to have all kinds of problems getting that axle into that wheel. So clean up the ends. When you go to put that axle in there, take the inside of the wheel, the flat surface, put some glue around the inside right there, run your dowel rod into it, hammer it in, push it in, whatever is appropriate, get the dowel rod flush with this end, wipe the glue off, and let it set. Now, when you go to put this into the body, you're going to put that in there. Now you're going to also put glue on the inside of the wheel right here. You're going to push that on. And one of the real secrets is to get that thing on for a pretty decent fit. You don't want a lot of slop this way, but you also don't want to get this thing driven on there to where it binds up on the body. So one of the neat little things you can do is take a piece of notebook plastic or folder plastic, cut a little U-shape into it like that, and what I do is I slide that over the axle right there. Then I pound the wheel in place or push it in place, whatever is appropriate, and that acts as a spacer. So I always get a good fit between my wheels and axles and the body of this vehicle. And those are easy to make. One of the things when you put the second wheel on here is you want to put glue on the inside. You want to make sure that this axle is not too long, because if you get that axle too long and you go push that wheel onto that axle, you push all of the glue out of the wheel and you push this down the axle, and pretty soon you don't have enough glue left in there to hold that axle onto that wheel. You may think you do, but if you let that set overnight and then take one of these things and do a test the next day, grab it by the wheels like this, twist one way on one of them, one on the other, and if you don't have enough glue in there, you'll get them to break loose, need to re-glue them. And that's common if you get too long an axle and you push all that glue out of there. That about the rest of the assembly is pretty simple once you get the wheels in there. Then you got just the dump body to attach to there. Pretty easy to eyeball that and get it on there straight. And again, the quick thick glue works well down here. Just run a big bead of it down through there, because you got a saw cut surface here, you got a saw cut surface here. It's not a nice smooth surface, so that fills the gaps, sets up quickly. And what I do I'm kind of a belt and suspenders type guy. I don't just glue it. I glue it and I take my little pin nailer and I put a couple of pins in there just to hold it in place to make sure that glue has plenty of chance to set up and it doesn't get shifted around on the workbench while it sets up. One thing I've learned this week is make sure that you use the right length pins, because if you use too long a pin and you put it in the right place back here, you just pin your axle into your body and you have to take things apart. So don't do that either. Save yourself a lot of grief. And so what you end up with is a nice little haul truck. Looks something like this. It's not a dump body. Dump bodies get to be much more difficult to do. But a nice little haul truck. And if you feel ambitious, coat of yellow paint on that haul truck. Makes it look like something a little more. Paint the tires black if you want to. I painted the axle pegs black on this one. They could have been silver to give it a little more contrast. And if you're really ambitious, you could paint a little windshield on the front of this thing. But you end up with a nice little toy. Pretty easy to make. Requires nothing but 2x4s, basically a bandsaw and some other hand tools, some sandpaper. Pretty nice little thing to get started with.